May 15, 1969. Fairmont, Minnesota native Doug Kaler gripped the M60 machine gun as his UH-1 Huey lifted off from Fire Support Base Charlie in the Mekong Delta. 20 years old, barely 6 months out of basic training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Kaler had volunteered for this assignment. He wanted to be where the action was. The helicopter banked sharply left, door sliding open to reveal endless green canopy stretching toward the horizon. Kaler's finger rested on the trigger of a weapon that could fire 700 rounds per minute. Each 7.62 millimeter cartridge fed from a belt that snaked across the helicopter floor. The roar of rotor blades mixed with the humid Vietnamese air rushing through the cabin. "First time out," shouted the crew chief over the engine noise. Kaler nodded, checking his safety harness one more time. Below them, the jungle looked peaceful from 1,500 feet. No muzzle flashes, no smoke trails, just an unbroken carpet of vegetation hiding an enemy that had been fighting in these forests for decades. The radio crackled. "Phoenix 1-3, we have troops in contact. Grid coordinates follows." Within seconds, the peaceful morning transformed. The pilot pushed the cyclic forward, diving toward a clearing where American soldiers were pinned down by automatic weapons fire. Kaler could see the distinctive green tracers of AK-47 rounds cutting through the trees. Return fire from M16 rifles created a deadly light show in the jungle canopy. "Gunners, you are cleared to engage," came the command through his headset. This was the moment every door gunner trained for but never fully understood until it happened. The helicopter descended rapidly, banking to give Kaler a clear field of fire. His world narrowed to iron sights, muzzle flashes, and the rhythmic percussion of his M60 as it answered enemy fire with American resolve. Doug Kaler had joined the ranks of Vietnam's door gunners, a brotherhood forged in the skies above Southeast Asia. Men who would fly over 10 million flight hours during the conflict. Men who would witness the transformation of helicopter warfare from transport missions to aerial cavalry charges. Men whose stories would become the stuff of legend, myth, and often tragic reality. The helicopter war in Vietnam had begun. The mythology surrounding Vietnam War door gunners has persisted for decades, fueled by Hollywood films and urban legends that paint their service as a guaranteed death sentence. Popular culture suggests these men faced astronomical casualty rates, with some claims stating their life expectancy measured in days or weeks. The reality, documented in Pentagon records and military archives, tells a dramatically different story. Roughly 2,700 non-pilot helicopter crewmen died during the entire Vietnam conflict. When measured against the over 10 million flight hours logged by helicopters during the war, these casualties reveal a startling statistical truth. Being a door gunner was not the suicide mission many believe it to have been. The numbers demand context. Over 40,000 helicopter pilots served in Vietnam, according to Pentagon databases. The total non-pilot crew member death toll of 2,112 includes not just door gunners, but crew chiefs, medics, loadmasters, and other aviation personnel. When distributed across the war's duration and the massive scale of helicopter operations, the mortality rate becomes significantly lower than infantry casualty percentages. But statistics only reveal part of the door gunner experience. The psychological impact of their service created wounds that numbers cannot measure. Every flight carried the possibility of catastrophic loss. Every landing zone might conceal enemy rockets or automatic weapons fire. The hypervigilance required to scan jungle canopy for muzzle flashes left permanent impressions on young minds. Sergeant Robert R. Telfer from Fonda, New York, and Corporal Orson H. Case from Johnstown, New York, died in a helicopter crash on July 15, 1966, just west of Albany. Their deaths illustrate how quickly peaceful missions could turn deadly. Not from enemy fire, but from the inherent dangers of low-level flight operations in hostile territory. The psychological burden extended beyond personal survival. Door gunners witnessed events that challenged every assumption about warfare they had carried from civilian life. They provided covering fire for medical evacuations, watching wounded Americans loaded onto stretchers. They supported search and rescue missions, sometimes arriving too late to help downed air crews. They delivered supplies to isolated fire bases, seeing the exhaustion and desperation in soldiers' faces. Gary Hallman, a private who specifically requested door gunner duty, later reflected on his motivation. He wanted to be where the action was. This desire for combat, common among young men facing their first war, collided with the complex realities of helicopter operations. Door gunners occupied a unique position in the military hierarchy, enlisted men wielding extraordinary firepower, making split-second decisions that could determine mission success or failure. The M60 machine gun became their primary weapon, a belt-fed automatic rifle capable of devastating suppressive fire. Each door gunner carried responsibility for maintaining, cleaning, and operating this weapon system. The technical expertise required went far beyond pulling a trigger. Understanding ammunition types, managing overheating, clearing jams under fire. These skills separated effective door gunners from liability. The helicopter war introduced new tactical concepts that traditional military training had never addressed. Close air support from hovering platforms, suppressive fire delivered from moving aircraft, coordinated attacks between ground forces and aerial gunners operating mere hundreds of feet above friendly positions. The margin for error measured in inches and seconds. Douglas Kaler's experience exemplifies the complexity of door gunner service. Originally trained as an electrician and assigned to fire department duties, he volunteered for helicopter duty out of dissatisfaction with his rear echelon assignment. His journey from construction work to combat aviation illustrates how the war's personnel needs created unexpected career paths for young soldiers. The mythology persists because door gunner service contained elements of extraordinary danger alongside routine transport missions. A single rocket-propelled grenade could transform a milk run into a disaster. Enemy small arms fire could disable aircraft systems or wound crew members without warning. The randomness of combat created an environment where survival often depended more on luck than skill. Pentagon records show approximately 2,500 Hueys were lost to enemy fire during the conflict. This high attrition rate directly impacted door gunner survival, but not in the ways popular culture suggests. Most aircraft losses occurred during landing or takeoff, when helicopters became vulnerable to pre-positioned enemy weapons. Door gunners faced their greatest danger not during dramatic aerial firefights, but during seemingly routine operations in contested areas. The truth about door gunner mortality rates challenges both heroic myths and dismissive statistics. These men served in an extraordinarily dangerous environment, where death could arrive without warning. But they also performed thousands of successful missions, saved countless American lives, and demonstrated remarkable professionalism under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Their real story begins with understanding this paradox. Door gunners faced genuine mortal danger while maintaining survival rates that defied popular assumptions about their service. The statistical reality of helicopter operations in Vietnam reveals the true scale of door gunner service and sacrifice. Pentagon databases, maintained by the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association and cross-referenced with Department of Defense records, provide concrete numbers that dispel myths while honoring genuine losses. 11,146 United States helicopters served in Vietnam between 1961 and 1975. Of these aircraft, 5,607 were lost to various causes: enemy fire, mechanical failure, weather, and operational accidents. The loss rate of 47.3% represents one of the highest aircraft attrition percentages in American military history, exceeding even the devastating bomber losses over Germany during World War II. 2,165 helicopter pilots died during the conflict. 2,712 non-pilot crew members perished, including door gunners, crew chiefs, flight engineers, and medical personnel. These 4,977 aviation casualties occurred across more than 10 million flight hours, creating a loss rate of approximately 0.49 deaths per 1,000 flight hours. While every loss represented a family devastated and a young life ended, the statistical probability of survival on any individual mission remained relatively high. The UH-1 Huey helicopter, the primary aircraft employing door gunners, carried a standard crew of 4: pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and door gunner. Some configurations included 2 door gunners, increasing crew size to 5. During peak operations in 1968-1969, over 2,000 Hueys operated simultaneously in South Vietnam, requiring approximately 8,000 to 10,000 door gunners to maintain combat readiness. Door gunners operated M60 machine guns capable of firing 550 to 650 rounds per minute, depending on configuration and barrel condition. Each aircraft typically carried 2,000 to 3,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, divided between both door positions. During sustained combat operations, gunners could expend their entire ammunition load in less than 5 minutes of continuous fire. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, deployed to Vietnam in September 1965, pioneered large-scale helicopter assault tactics. Their operations required 434 aircraft, including 16 CH-54 heavy-lift helicopters, 6 CH-47 medium transports, and 412 UH-1 helicopters. This single division alone employed over 800 door gunners during full-strength operations. Ammunition expenditure statistics reveal the intensity of door gunner engagement. During the 1968 Tet Offensive, helicopter units consumed over 24 million rounds of small arms ammunition in the first month alone. Door gunners contributed significantly to this total, with individual aircraft sometimes requiring ammunition resupply multiple times per day during heavy combat periods. Medical evacuation missions, codenamed Dust-Off, represented door gunner operations at their most critical. These missions transported 900,000 patients during the war, with door gunners providing defensive fire for aircraft landing in contested areas. The Red Cross protection accorded to medical aircraft proved meaningless to enemy forces, making dust-off missions among the most dangerous helicopter operations. Fire support bases throughout South Vietnam depended on helicopter resupply for survival. Firebase Charlie, Firebase Alpha, Firebase Delta, isolated positions that required daily helicopter visits for ammunition, food, water, and personnel rotation. Door gunners on these supply runs faced constant threat from enemy mortars, rockets, and small arms fire positioned along flight routes. The AH-1 Cobra gunship, introduced in 1967, carried 2 crew members and represented a different approach to helicopter warfare. Unlike transport helicopters with door gunners, Cobras concentrated firepower in purpose-built weapon systems. However, transport helicopters with door gunners continued performing missions that Cobras could not: medical evacuation, troop insertion, supply delivery, and command and control. Equipment failure caused significant casualties among helicopter crews. Engine malfunctions, transmission failures, and rotor system problems created emergency situations requiring immediate landing in hostile territory. Door gunners often became ground combat infantry during these incidents, defending crashed aircraft until rescue forces arrived. Night operations multiplied danger exponentially. Helicopter crews flew missions in complete darkness, navigating by instruments and radio beacons, while enemy forces used sound to track their movements. Door gunners could not effectively engage targets they could not see, creating vulnerability during the most critical phases of night missions. The 7th Squadron, 1st Cavalry Regiment, operated Huey helicopters throughout the war, logging over 500,000 flight hours with relatively low casualty rates. Their experience demonstrates how professional training, tactical discipline, and equipment maintenance could significantly improve survival odds for door gunners and flight crews. Weather conditions in Southeast Asia challenged every aspect of helicopter operations. Monsoon rains, tropical storms, and zero visibility conditions forced aircraft into dangerous low-level flight profiles. Door gunners faced the additional challenge of maintaining weapon systems in extreme humidity and temperature variations that caused equipment failures. The psychological toll of these statistics cannot be measured numerically. Each door gunner knew that 47% of helicopters would not survive the war. Each mission carried mathematical probability of death or injury. This knowledge, combined with the constant sensory assault of combat operations, created psychological wounds that would manifest decades after the shooting stopped. These numbers represent more than statistical abstractions. They document the service of young Americans who volunteered for extraordinarily dangerous duty and performed with remarkable effectiveness under impossible circumstances. The human reality behind door gunner statistics emerges through letters home, diary entries, and memoir accounts that capture experiences no military report could document. These personal testimonies reveal how young Americans processed the psychological complexity of aerial warfare while maintaining the emotional connections to home that kept them sane. No heroes, everyone did their part, and everyone was scared to death. Soldier Mark W. Harms wrote these words in 1968, summing up his combat experience during the Vietnam War. His letter, preserved in the collection Letters from Vietnam, Voices of War, articulates the democratic nature of fear under fire. Door gunners, despite their elevated position and heavy weapons, shared this universal military experience. Private Gary Hallman's story illustrates the volunteer nature of door gunner service. Specifically requesting assignment to helicopter duty, Hallman wanted to be where the action was. This desire for combat, common among young men facing their first war, reflected American cultural expectations about military service and masculine identity. Door gunner positions attracted soldiers seeking active engagement rather than support roles. Doug Kaler's service record provides detailed insight into the path from civilian to combat door gunner. Enlisting on May 15, 1968, and serving until his honorable discharge on June 17, 1970, Kaler's military career spanned the war's most intense period. His original training as an electrician at Fort Rucker, Alabama, followed by fire department assignment, demonstrates how the military's personnel needs often overrode individual occupational specialties. Kaler's dissatisfaction with rear echelon duties led to his volunteer application for helicopter service in May 1969. This decision pattern repeated throughout the war, as soldiers sought transfer from boring or seemingly meaningless assignments to combat positions that offered clear purpose and immediate results. Door gunner duty provided both excitement and obvious military value. The transition from civilian contractor work to aerial combat created psychological challenges that few training programs addressed adequately. Young men accustomed to construction schedules and safety regulations suddenly found themselves manning automatic weapons over hostile territory. The learning curve between basic military training and combat effectiveness measured in days or weeks rather than months. Letters home reveal the inadequacy of language to describe helicopter combat to civilian audiences. Door gunners struggled to explain experiences that had no parallel in American civilian life. How do you describe the sensation of firing 700 rounds per minute while flying 100 feet above jungle canopy? How do you communicate the hypervigilance required to distinguish enemy muzzle flashes from sunlight reflecting off water? William Gritzbaugh's account, Door Gunner for a Day, captures the intensity of helicopter operations from an infantry officer's perspective. His description of circling a hilltop battle site at an altitude just below the monsoon overcast illustrates the weather-dependent nature of helicopter missions. Door gunners operated in environmental conditions that challenged both human endurance and equipment reliability. The memoir literature reveals how door gunners developed personal rituals to manage pre-mission anxiety. Equipment checks became elaborate ceremonies. Loading procedures followed superstitious sequences. Lucky charms and religious tokens accompanied every flight. These behaviors provided psychological anchors in an environment where randomness determined survival more than skill or preparation. Family correspondence shows door gunners' attempts to reassure loved ones while processing their own fears. Letters home emphasized routine aspects of military service, mail call, mess hall food, recreational activities, while minimizing combat experiences. This protective filtering created emotional distance between combat veterans and civilian families that persisted long after the war ended. The technical nature of door gunner duties created professional pride that sustained morale during difficult periods. Maintaining M60 machine guns required mechanical expertise and attention to detail. Understanding ammunition characteristics, managing equipment malfunctions, and coordinating fire with ground forces demanded skills that transferred to civilian employment after military service. Crew relationships formed the emotional foundation of door gunner service. Four-man helicopter crews developed intimate bonds forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. Pilots relied on door gunners for threat detection and suppressive fire. Door gunners trusted pilots to position aircraft for effective engagement while avoiding enemy fire. These relationships often became the strongest friendships of participants' lives. The racial integration of helicopter crews preceded broader military integration by several years. Door gunners worked alongside Black, white, and Hispanic crew members without the tension that characterized other military units. Shared danger eliminated racial prejudices that civilian society maintained. Combat effectiveness mattered more than background or skin color. Medical evacuation missions created the most emotionally challenging experiences for door gunners. Witnessing severely wounded Americans loaded onto stretchers, providing covering fire while medics worked under enemy fire, defending aircraft during emergency medical procedures. These situations tested psychological resilience beyond normal combat stress. Night missions amplified every aspect of door gunner anxiety. Flying in complete darkness over hostile territory, unable to see threats until muzzle flashes revealed enemy positions, created terror that words cannot adequately describe. The acoustic signature of helicopter rotors provided enemy forces advance warning while door gunners flew blind into potential ambushes. These personal accounts revealed door gunner service as a complex psychological experience that combined genuine heroism with ordinary human fear, professional competence with improvisational survival, and deep bonds with lasting trauma. The door gunner experience extended far beyond individual heroics or isolated incidents, encompassing every theater of operations throughout South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. From the Mekong Delta's rice paddies to the mountainous jungles near the demilitarized zone, helicopter operations with door gunners became the tactical signature of American military involvement in Southeast Asia. I Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam, presented door gunners with their most challenging operational environment. The area's proximity to North Vietnam meant sophisticated enemy air defenses, including anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles. Helicopter operations near the DMZ required door gunners to scan for threats that could destroy aircraft before crews even knew they were being targeted. Firebase operations throughout I Corps depended entirely on helicopter resupply protected by door gunners. Firebase Charlie, Firebase Khe Sanh, Firebase Alpha, isolated positions that could only be reached by air. Door gunners on these supply runs faced pre-registered enemy mortars and carefully planned ambushes. The enemy knew helicopter flight patterns and timed attacks to maximize casualties during the most vulnerable moments of approach and departure. II Corps, encompassing South Vietnam's Central Highlands, created different tactical challenges for door gunners. The mountainous terrain limited helicopter maneuverability, while providing enemy forces excellent concealment and fields of fire. Door gunners learned to identify threats camouflaged among rock formations and jungle canopy that could hide entire enemy battalions. The Central Highlands battles of 1965-1966 established helicopter tactics that would define door gunner operations for the remainder of the war. The 1st Cavalry Division's air mobility operations demonstrated how door gunners could provide close air support for ground forces while simultaneously defending their aircraft from enemy fire. These missions required split-second coordination between aerial and ground elements. III Corps operations, centered around Saigon and surrounding provinces, presented door gunners with urban and suburban combat scenarios that training had never addressed. Flying over populated areas meant distinguishing between enemy combatants and civilian non-combatants while maintaining readiness to engage hostile forces. Door gunners faced rules of engagement that prohibited certain types of fire in populated areas. The Iron Triangle, Cu Chi District, and other heavily contested areas in the III Corps became laboratories for helicopter warfare innovation. Door gunners participated in tunnel rat support missions, underground cache destruction operations, and search and destroy sweeps that required precise fire control to avoid friendly casualties. The proximity of enemy and friendly forces measured in meters rather than kilometers. IV Corps, the Mekong Delta region, provided door gunners with their most diverse operational experience. River patrol support, amphibious assault cover, and interdiction missions against enemy supply lines, required adapting standard helicopter tactics to waterborne operations. Door gunners learned to distinguish between legitimate fishing boats and enemy supply vessels, while providing overwatch for Navy patrol craft. The Mobile Riverine Force operations in the Mekong Delta created unique tactical requirements for door gunners. Coordinating fire support for riverboat operations while avoiding friendly casualties required precision that exceeded normal military training. Door gunners developed expertise in low-level flight operations over water that translated to search and rescue capabilities. Cross-border operations into Cambodia and Laos expanded door gunner responsibilities beyond South Vietnamese territory. These classified missions, conducted without official acknowledgement, required door gunners to operate in areas where no rescue forces existed. Aircraft shot down in Cambodia or Laos faced enemy capture with minimal chance of recovery. The Ho Chi Minh Trail Interdiction Campaign placed door gunners at the center of strategic air operations designed to disrupt enemy supply lines. Flying over heavily defended transportation routes, door gunners engaged truck convoys, supply depots, and anti-aircraft positions that protected North Vietnamese logistics networks. These missions carried extraordinary risk for minimal tactical gain. Special operations missions expanded door gunner roles beyond standard transport and fire support duties. Inserting and extracting reconnaissance teams, supporting prisoner-of-war rescue attempts, and conducting psychological operations required door gunners to master specialized tactics not covered in conventional training programs. The regional differences in enemy tactics required door gunners to constantly adapt their techniques. Northern regions featured sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons and coordinated ambushes. Central Highlands emphasized small unit actions and individual marksmanship. Southern areas included booby traps and guerrilla warfare tactics that made every landing zone potentially lethal. Weather patterns varied significantly across South Vietnam's geographic regions, creating operational challenges that affected door gunner effectiveness. Monsoon seasons limited visibility and flight operations in northern areas, while southern regions faced typhoons and severe thunderstorms. Door gunners learned to operate in environmental conditions that grounded civilian aviation. The helicopter maintenance requirements created logistical challenges that directly impacted door gunner operations. Forward operating bases throughout all 4 core areas required spare parts, ammunition, and technical expertise to maintain aircraft combat readiness. Door gunners often performed basic maintenance duties in addition to their combat responsibilities. Each geographic region developed distinct tactical innovations that reflected local conditions and enemy capabilities. Door gunners learned these regional variations through experience rather than formal training, creating a body of practical knowledge that existed only in veteran communities. This geographic expertise became invaluable for training replacement personnel and developing improved tactics. The expansion of helicopter operations across Southeast Asia transformed door gunner service from individual survival to comprehensive tactical system. The evolution of helicopter warfare reached its technological and tactical pinnacle with the introduction of specialized gunship variants and the refinement of door gunner equipment systems. The transition from improvised transport aircraft with mounted weapons to purpose-built aerial weapons platforms represented a revolutionary change in military tactics that redefined door gunner roles and capabilities. The AH-1 Cobra gunship, first deployed to Vietnam in September 1967, embodied this evolutionary leap. Unlike transport helicopters with door gunners manning defensive weapons, Cobras carried integrated weapon systems operated by specialized crew members. The aircraft featured a tandem cockpit design with the pilot in the rear seat and gunner in the front, both protected by armor plating and bulletproof glass. Cobra armament included a nose-mounted M197 20mm cannon, 70mm rocket pods, and optional TOW anti-tank missiles. The front seat gunner controlled these weapons through sophisticated sighting systems that provided magnified target acquisition and ballistic calculation capabilities. This technological advancement represented the ultimate expression of helicopter-borne firepower. However, transport helicopters with door gunners remained essential for missions that gunships could not perform. Medical evacuation, troop insertion, supply delivery, and command and control required the cargo capacity and versatility that only transport aircraft could provide. Door gunners on these missions evolved from defensive weapons operators to integrated fire support specialists. The M60 machine gun underwent continuous improvement throughout the war to meet door gunner requirements. The M60D variant, specifically designed for helicopter installation, featured a shortened barrel, modified stock, and specialized mounting system that allowed 360-degree traverse within the aircraft's field of fire. These improvements increased effective range and sustained fire capability, while reducing weight and mechanical complexity. Ammunition development paralleled weapon improvements. Standard 7. 62mm NATO rounds proved inadequate for certain target types, leading to the introduction of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer variants. Door gunners learned to mix ammunition types to achieve maximum effectiveness against different target categories. A typical ammunition load might include 60% ball rounds, 20% armor-piercing, 15% incendiary, and 5% tracer for target marking. The integration of door gunner fire with close air support operations required unprecedented coordination between helicopter crews and fixed-wing aircraft. Door gunners learned to identify friendly aircraft by silhouette, engine sound, and flight characteristics to avoid fratricide incidents. The compressed timescale of aerial combat left no margin for identification errors. Night vision technology began appearing in limited quantities during the war's final years. Door gunners equipped with starlight scopes could engage targets in conditions that previously rendered them defenseless. However, the technology remained experimental and unreliable, forcing crews to maintain traditional visual acquisition techniques as primary methods. Communication systems evolved to accommodate the complex coordination requirements of multi-aircraft operations. Door gunners received individual radio headsets that allowed direct communication with ground forces, air controllers, and other aircraft. This technological capability enabled real-time tactical adjustments based on battlefield conditions observed from aerial platforms. The psychological impact of technological advancement created unexpected challenges for door gunners. Improved equipment raised expectations for combat effectiveness, while increasing the complexity of systems that required maintenance under field conditions. Door gunners became technicians as well as warriors, responsible for sophisticated equipment that often failed under combat stress. Training programs struggled to keep pace with technological innovation. Door gunner schools taught weapons and tactics that were obsolete by the time students reached combat units. Veterans developed informal training networks that transmitted practical knowledge about new equipment and tactics directly to replacement personnel without formal institutional support. The Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965 demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated helicopter operations with door gunner support. The 1st Cavalry Division's air assault into the Ia Drang Valley required door gunners to provide covering fire for troop landings while defending transport aircraft from enemy ground fire. The battle's success validated helicopter warfare concepts that would define military tactics for decades. Equipment reliability became a critical factor in door gunner effectiveness. The M60 machine gun's reputation for jamming under combat conditions required door gunners to develop expertise in immediate action drills and preventive maintenance procedures. A weapon malfunction during enemy contact could prove fatal for the entire aircraft crew. Supply chain management for door gunner equipment revealed logistical challenges that traditional military systems had never addressed. Helicopter units required spare parts, specialized tools, and technical manuals for weapon systems that differed significantly from standard infantry equipment. Forward supply points often lacked critical components needed to maintain door gunner readiness. The development of enemy countermeasures forced continuous adaptation of door gunner tactics and equipment. North Vietnamese forces learned to time attacks during helicopter vulnerability periods and to position weapons for maximum effectiveness against aerial targets. Door gunners responded by varying flight patterns, adjusting approach techniques, and developing new suppression tactics. Medical treatment for door gunner wounds required specialized procedures adapted to helicopter evacuation limitations. Combat medics learned to treat injuries sustained in aerial combat, while preparing patients for immediate transport to field hospitals. The confined space and vibration of helicopter interiors created unique challenges for battlefield medical care. This technological revolution transformed door gunner service from improvised defensive measure to sophisticated military specialty. The psychological escalation of door gunner service intensified as the war progressed, creating a cascade of mental and emotional challenges that exceeded any training program's ability to prepare young Americans for the reality of prolonged aerial combat operations. The accumulation of missions, casualties, and moral complexity pushed door gunners beyond the breaking point of human psychological endurance. The repetitive nature of helicopter operations created a false sense of routine that masked mounting psychological pressure. Day after day, door gunners flew the same routes, landed at the same fire bases, and engaged the same enemy positions. This apparent predictability concealed the random nature of combat that could transform routine missions into life-or-death struggles without warning. Survivor guilt became endemic among door gunner veterans as they witnessed aircraft shot down, crew members killed, and ground forces overrun despite their best efforts to provide fire support. The elevated perspective from helicopter platforms allowed door gunners to observe combat outcomes that ground forces could not see, creating knowledge that became psychological burden. The moral complexity of civilian casualties weighed heavily on door gunners, who operated in populated areas, where enemy forces deliberately used non-combatants as shields. Rules of engagement prohibited firing into populated areas, but enemy forces exploited these restrictions to attack helicopters from positions near civilian structures. Door gunners faced impossible choices between mission accomplishment and civilian protection. Sleep deprivation compounded psychological stress as helicopter operations continued around the clock to maintain tactical pressure on enemy forces. Door gunners flew multiple missions per day with minimal rest periods between flights. The accumulated fatigue impaired judgment precisely when split-second decisions determined survival for entire aircraft crews. The sensory assault of continuous helicopter operations created permanent neurological changes that manifested decades after military service ended. The constant noise of rotor blades, engine vibration, and weapons fire damaged hearing while creating hypersensitivity to sudden sounds. Door gunners learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire by sound alone, skills that proved useless in civilian environments. Drug and alcohol abuse increased throughout helicopter units as personnel sought escape from psychological pressure that never diminished. The military's official policies prohibited substance abuse, but informal tolerance developed when senior leaders recognized the coping mechanisms necessary to maintain operational effectiveness. Door gunners used alcohol to achieve sleep and drugs to maintain alertness during extended combat operations. The relationship between fear and effectiveness created paradoxes that challenged traditional military psychology. Door gunners who became too comfortable with danger lost the hypervigilance necessary for survival. Those who remained paralyzed by fear could not function effectively in combat. The optimal psychological state balanced controlled fear with aggressive competence. Combat stress reactions manifested in various forms among door gunner personnel. Some veterans developed inability to tolerate enclosed spaces, reflecting the confined nature of helicopter interiors during combat. Others experienced panic attacks triggered by sudden loud noises, reminiscent of incoming artillery or small arms fire. These symptoms often appeared years after military service ended. The transition from combat to civilian life proved particularly difficult for door gunners whose military experience had no civilian equivalent. Commercial aviation careers attracted some veterans, but the structured environment of civilian flying could not replicate the adrenaline and immediate purpose of combat operations. Many door gunners struggled with depression and purposelessness after military discharge. Family relationships suffered as door gunners found themselves unable to communicate experiences that civilian loved ones could not understand or relate to. The vocabulary necessary to describe aerial combat did not exist in civilian conversation. Veterans learned to compartmentalize their military experience, creating emotional distance that protected family members but isolated veterans from civilian support systems. The randomness of combat created spiritual crises that traditional religious frameworks could not address. Door gunners witnessed good men die while incompetent personnel survived through luck rather than skill. The absence of moral causation in combat outcomes challenged belief systems that assumed virtue would be rewarded and evil punished. Replacement personnel arriving in combat units faced psychological challenges from experienced door gunners who had developed cynical attitudes toward military leadership and strategic objectives. Veterans learned not to invest emotional energy in new personnel who might not survive their first month of combat operations. This protective mechanism created social isolation that compounded the psychological burden of combat service. The medical treatment available for combat stress proved inadequate for the complex psychological trauma that door gunners experienced. Military psychiatrists lacked understanding of aerial combat stress and often misdiagnosed symptoms as character defects rather than legitimate medical conditions. Dr. Gunners learned to conceal psychological symptoms to avoid career-ending medical discharge. The compression of intense experiences into relatively short time periods created memory distortions that plagued door gunner veterans for decades. Events that occurred over months or years seemed compressed into single continuous experiences, while individual combat missions expanded in memory to occupy disproportionate psychological space. The brotherhood bonds formed among helicopter crews provided both psychological support and additional sources of survivor guilt when crew members were killed or wounded. Door gunners carried responsibility not only for their own survival, but for the safety of pilots and crew chiefs who depended on their defensive fire. The weight of this mutual dependence exceeded normal military unit cohesion. This psychological escalation transformed door gunner service from military occupation to life-defining experience that shaped veteran identity permanently. The psychological transformation experienced by door gunners extended far beyond the end of their military service, creating lifelong mental health challenges that the Veterans Administration and civilian medical systems proved inadequate to address. The unique nature of helicopter combat trauma produced symptoms that did not match existing diagnostic categories for post-traumatic stress disorder. Hypervigilance, developed as a survival mechanism during combat operations, persisted decades after military discharge. Door gunner veterans found themselves constantly scanning civilian environments for potential threats, unable to turn off the mental processes that had kept them alive in Vietnam. Shopping malls, parking lots, and wooded areas triggered automatic threat assessment behaviors that exhausted mental resources and strained family relationships. The acoustic sensitivity developed from years of distinguishing between different types of weapons fire by sound alone created permanent neurological changes. Door gunner veterans startled violently at sudden noises, car backfires, construction sounds, fireworks, that reminded them of incoming artillery or small arms fire. Sleep became elusive as the brain remained alert for auditory threats that no longer existed. Survivor guilt manifested in complex forms that traditional therapy struggled to address. Door gunners carried responsibility for aircraft crews who had depended on their defensive fire, ground forces they had supported with covering fire, and civilian populations they had been unable to protect from enemy attacks. The weight of these responsibilities created depression that resisted standard treatment approaches. The spiritual crises initiated during combat deepened in civilian life as veterans struggled to find meaning in experiences that seemed to negate fundamental assumptions about justice, morality, and divine providence. Door gunners had witnessed randomness triumph over virtue, seen good men die while incompetent personnel survived, and participated in violence that served no clear strategic purpose. Religious faith, when it survived combat experience, often transformed into something unrecognizable to civilian congregations. Door gunner veterans spoke of God in terms that reflected intimate familiarity with death and moral ambiguity. Traditional religious platitudes about divine protection and moral justice rang hollow for men who had seen prayers go unanswered and virtue unrewarded in combat. Alcohol became the primary self-medication for door gunner veterans struggling with civilian adjustment. The military's informal tolerance for drinking as a coping mechanism created habits that proved destructive in civilian employment and family relationships. Veterans Affairs counselors, many of whom lacked combat experience, failed to understand how alcohol served specific psychological functions for combat veterans. The absence of mission purpose in civilian life created existential depression that exceeded normal adjustment difficulties. Door gunner service, despite its dangers and psychological cost, had provided clear objectives and immediate feedback about effectiveness. Civilian employment rarely offered the same sense of purpose or immediate results, leaving veterans feeling disconnected from meaningful activity. Relationship difficulties stemmed from communication barriers that couples therapy could not bridge. Door gunner veterans found themselves unable to explain experiences that had no civilian equivalent. Attempting to describe the sensation of firing automatic weapons while flying over hostile territory, or the responsibility of defending wounded Americans during medical evacuation, required vocabulary and emotional framework that civilian spouses did not possess. The compressed intensity of combat experience created memory distortions that manifested as dissociation and emotional numbing. Events that occurred over months seemed compressed into continuous experiences, while individual missions expanded to occupy disproportionate psychological space. This temporal distortion interfered with the narrative coherence necessary for psychological healing. Night terrors and recurring nightmares plagued door gunner veterans for decades after military service. The dreams often featured scenarios where veterans found themselves unable to operate their weapons, while aircraft came under enemy fire. These nightmares reflected the ultimate fear of professional inadequacy during moments when lives depended on technical competence. The hypermasculine culture of military aviation created barriers to seeking mental health treatment. Door gunners had been trained to suppress fear, endure pain, and maintain emotional control under extreme stress. Admitting to psychological problems violated the identity they had constructed around professional competence and emotional toughness. Family members, particularly spouses and children, developed secondary trauma symptoms from living with combat veterans whose psychological wounds remained untreated. The hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and periodic rage outbursts characteristic of combat trauma created household environments that resembled combat zones more than civilian homes. Employment difficulties arose when Dr. Gunner veterans attempted to translate their military experience into civilian career opportunities. The technical skills acquired in helicopter operations, weapons maintenance, communication procedures, tactical coordination, had limited application in civilian occupations. Veterans often found themselves overqualified for entry-level positions, but lacking credentials for professional employment. The delayed onset of post-traumatic stress symptoms caught many door gunner veterans unprepared. Psychological problems that had remained manageable during active duty service intensified years or decades later as veterans faced major life transitions, health problems, or family crises that triggered combat-related memories and emotions. Support networks among door gunner veterans provided the most effective treatment for combat-related psychological problems. Veterans who maintained contact with former crew members often showed better adjustment outcomes than those who isolated themselves from military connections. The shared understanding of combat experience created therapeutic relationships that professional counselors could not replicate. This mental transformation represented the war's most enduring casualty, the permanent alteration of human consciousness by experiences that exceeded the boundaries of normal psychological resilience. 45 years after the last American helicopter departed Saigon, door gunner veterans emerged from decades of silence to share stories that had remained locked away in private memory. The passage of time had not healed their wounds, but had provided perspective on experiences that seemed incomprehensible to younger generations, raised on sanitized media portrayals of military service. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in Washington, D.C., in 1982, became a pilgrimage destination for door gunner veterans seeking names of crew members and ground personnel they had known during the war. Panel 23E contains the name of Corporal Michael James Murphy, a door gunner killed when his helicopter was shot down near An Khe on March 15, 1969. His story represents thousands of similar losses that receive no individual recognition in historical accounts. Doug Kaler, the Minnesota native who had volunteered for door gunner duty in 1969, returned from Vietnam to work in construction and later became a successful businessman. His post-war career path typified many door gunner veterans who translated their military technical skills into civilian occupations. However, the psychological adjustment proved more challenging than professional success. "I still dream about it," Kaler admitted in a 2014 interview with the Vietnam Veterans Association. "Not every night, but when I do, I'm back in that helicopter and something's wrong with the gun." This recurring nightmare theme, equipment failure during combat, appeared consistently in Door Gunner veteran accounts, reflecting their ultimate fear of professional inadequacy when lives depended on their performance. The delayed recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder as a legitimate medical condition provided Door Gunner veterans with diagnostic categories that explained symptoms they had carried for decades. The Veterans Administration's expansion of PTSD treatment programs in the 1980s and 1990s offered therapeutic resources that had not existed when veterans first returned from Southeast Asia. However, the specialized nature of helicopter combat trauma remained poorly understood by civilian mental health professionals. Door Gunners had experienced warfare from a unique perspective that combined the intimacy of ground combat with the technological complexity of aviation operations. Standard PTSD treatment protocols designed for infantry veterans proved inadequate for addressing the specific psychological profile of aerial warfare. Reunion organizations for helicopter units provided the most effective long-term support for Door Gunner veterans. The 1st Cavalry Division Association, the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, and similar groups created venues where veterans could share experiences with others who understood the technical and emotional aspects of their military service. These gatherings often produced therapeutic breakthroughs that years of professional counseling had not achieved. The children and grandchildren of Door Gunner veterans began seeking information about their family members' military service as the Vietnam War transitioned from contemporary controversy to historical study. Many veterans had never discussed their combat experience with family members, creating knowledge gaps that younger generations sought to fill through military records and veteran interviews. Medical research on Vietnam veteran health outcomes revealed disturbing patterns of cancer, neurological disorders, and cardiovascular disease among personnel who had served in Southeast Asia. Door Gunners showed elevated rates of certain health problems, possibly related to exposure to Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants during low-level flight operations over contaminated areas. The technological advancement of military aviation created opportunities for Door Gunner veterans to contribute their experience to contemporary military training programs. The similarities between Vietnam-era helicopter operations and modern counterinsurgency warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan made veteran expertise valuable for preparing new generations of aircrew personnel for combat operations. Hollywood portrayals of Door Gunner service, while often technically inaccurate, brought public attention to experiences that had remained largely invisible in popular culture. Films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and We Were Soldiers included Door Gunner characters that helped civilian audiences understand the complexity of helicopter warfare, even when dramatic license distorted historical accuracy. The oral history projects conducted by universities and military museums began preserving Door Gunner accounts that would otherwise disappear with veteran mortality. These interviews captured not only combat experiences, but also the psychological and social dimensions of military service that official records could not document. Some Door Gunner veterans found healing through returning to Vietnam as tourists, visiting former battle sites, and meeting with Vietnamese civilians who had lived through the war from the other perspective. These reconciliation visits provided closure that decades of civilian life had not achieved, allowing veterans to process experiences in the geographical context where they had occurred. The broader recognition of Vietnam veterans' contributions to American military history coincided with national acknowledgement that political opposition to the war had unfairly stigmatized individual service members. Door Gunner veterans, like other Vietnam veterans, experienced a gradual shift from social marginalization to respected status as the nation separated military service from political policy. The legacy of Door Gunner service extends beyond individual veteran experiences to influence contemporary military doctrine and training. The lessons learned about helicopter vulnerability, crew coordination, and psychological resilience inform current aviation operations in ways that validate the sacrifices of Vietnam-era personnel. This historical epilogue demonstrates how Door Gunner veterans transformed from forgotten participants to recognized contributors to American military heritage. It was a war of impossible choices. Young Americans, barely out of high school, found themselves manning machine guns and aircraft flying over hostile territory where every tree line concealed potential death. Door gunners faced split-second decisions that determined whether fellow Americans lived or died, whether missions succeeded or failed, whether aircraft returned safely, or became smoking wreckage in jungle clearings. It was a war of technological paradox. The most advanced military in human history, equipped with sophisticated helicopters and automatic weapons, fought an enemy that used bamboo spears and bicycle transportation networks. Door gunners operated complex weapon systems against an opponent whose greatest advantage was intimate knowledge of local terrain and unlimited patience for protracted conflict. It was a war of moral complexity. Door gunners provided fire support for medical evacuation missions that saved American lives while participating in combat operations that destroyed Vietnamese villages. They defended isolated fire bases that served no strategic purpose, while risking their lives for fellow soldiers whose only crime was answering their country's call to military service. The statistical reality of door gunner service challenges both heroic mythology and dismissive cynicism. 2,112 non-pilot crew members died during the Vietnam conflict, a significant loss that represented real families devastated and young lives ended. However, when measured against over 10 million flight hours and thousands of successful missions, these casualties demonstrate remarkable professional competence under extraordinarily dangerous circumstances. The human cost cannot be calculated in numbers alone. Door gunner veterans carried psychological wounds that proved more enduring than physical injuries. Hypervigilance, developed as a combat survival mechanism, persisted decades after military discharge. The acoustic sensitivity required to distinguish between different types of weapons. Fire by sound alone created permanent neurological changes that affected civilian life in ways that families and employers could not understand. The geographic scope of door gunner operations encompassed every region of South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. From the Mekong Delta's rice paddies to the mountainous jungles near the demilitarized zone, helicopter operations with door gunners became the tactical signature of American military involvement in Southeast Asia. Each region presented unique challenges that required constant adaptation of equipment and tactics. The technological evolution of helicopter warfare transformed door gunner service from improvised defensive measure to sophisticated military specialty. The introduction of the AH-1 Cobra gunship and improvements to the M60 machine gun reflected military innovation driven by combat necessity, rather than theoretical planning. Door gunners became technicians as well as warriors, responsible for complex equipment that often failed under combat stress. The psychological escalation of prolonged combat operations pushed door gunners beyond the breaking point of human endurance. The repetitive nature of helicopter missions created false routine that masked mounting psychological pressure. Survivor guilt, moral complexity, and sensory assault combined to produce mental health challenges that exceeded military medical systems' capacity for treatment. The delayed recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder as a legitimate medical condition provided door gunner veterans with diagnostic categories that explained symptoms they had carried for decades. However, the specialized nature of helicopter combat trauma remained poorly understood by civilian mental health professionals, who lacked familiarity with aerial warfare's unique psychological profile. The historical epilogue of Dr. Gunner's service demonstrates how these forgotten participants became recognized contributors to American military heritage. Reunion organizations provided more effective long-term support than professional counseling. Oral history projects preserved accounts that would otherwise disappear with veteran mortality. Hollywood portrayals, while often inaccurate, brought public attention to experiences that had remained invisible in popular culture. The legacy extends beyond individual veteran experiences to influence contemporary military doctrine and training. The lessons learned about helicopter vulnerability, crew coordination, and psychological resilience inform current aviation operations in ways that validate the sacrifices of Vietnam-era personnel. Modern door gunners in Iraq and Afghanistan benefited from tactical knowledge purchased with blood in Southeast Asian jungles. The moral questions raised by Dr. Gunner's service remain unresolved. How does a democratic society ask young citizens to participate in warfare that serves unclear strategic objectives? What obligations do civilian leaders have to military personnel who follow orders in good faith, even when those orders lack coherent purpose? How should a nation honor military service while acknowledging the political failures that made such service necessary? The door gunner experience encapsulates the broader Vietnam War paradox. Individual acts of courage and sacrifice occurred within a strategic framework that proved fundamentally flawed. These young Americans demonstrated remarkable professionalism under impossible circumstances, while serving political objectives that their leaders could not clearly articulate or successfully achieve. Their service deserves recognition not as validation of military policy, but as testament to human resilience under extreme stress. Door gunners maintained professional standards and mutual loyalty, even when larger strategic purposes proved illusory. They created meaning through personal relationships and immediate tactical objectives when broader war aims became meaningless. The unbelievable true story of Vietnam's door gunners reveals both the potential and limitations of American military power. Technological superiority and individual courage proved insufficient to achieve political objectives that required cultural understanding and historical perspective. The helicopter war succeeded tactically while failing strategically, producing tactical innovations that endure while serving strategic purposes that history has judged harshly. It was a war of fire that forged unbreakable bonds among young Americans who answered their country's call. It was a war of doubt that challenged every assumption about military power and political purpose. It was a war that changed America forever, leaving questions about sacrifice, service, and national responsibility that each generation must answer anew. Subscribe for more untold stories from the Vietnam War archives. Share in the comments how this war affected your family or community. These voices must be heard before they are lost to time.